In the small village of Umuaka, where the red earth glistened under the African sun, and the mango trees swayed with the laughter of children, lived Baba Chike, a man unlike any other. For while his neighbors measured wealth by the size of their yam barns, herds, and the clatter of their motorcycles, Chike measured his fortune in the soil he carefully tended behind his modest mud brick home, a patch no bigger than 10 steps across, a garden mocked by all who saw him bend day after day to plant, water, and whisper blessings to the crops as though they were his own children. And yet within that seemingly insignificant dirt lay a secret that would one day feed nations, a secret he had inherited decades earlier from Mr. Henry, a European researcher who had entrusted young Chike with seeds bred to endure drought, pests, and famine, advising him to guard them well, words that lodged deep in his heart even as the boy hid the seeds in a calabash and returned to the rhythm of village life, helping his mother pound yam, chasing goats, and listening to elders discuss politics under the shade of the Iroko tree, while neighbors and even his brothers mocked his obsession with soil, laughing at a man who spoke to plants as if they were companions, who refused to join in the city-bound ambitions of Emeka, his eldest son, or the lucrative land deals of Oga Namdi. Yet Chike remained patient, quietly tending his garden, teaching his youngest daughter Nodrozi the language of leaves, the strength of roots, the wisdom of the soil, telling her that patience and care could yield more than greed ever could, all the while enduring ridicule, the occasional pebbles thrown by playful children, and the disbelief of neighbors who called him foolish for investing in what appeared to be a meaningless patch of land. And yet when the great drought came, when rivers dried, cassava wilted, and famine stalked every household, Chike's garden flourished where others failed, producing maize, beans, and cassava that fed not only his family, but dozens of villagers who came secretly at first, then openly, to receive the food that saved them from starvation. And when journalists, government officials, and scientists arrived to witness the miracle, Chike humbly explained the truth of the seeds and the long years of careful cultivation, refusing offers of millions from foreign corporations who wished to buy the secret for themselves, insisting instead that Africa's farmers must benefit first, forming a cooperative that taught villages from Nigeria to Kenya to Ghana how to grow, save and share the resilient seeds, transforming famine-stricken regions into fields of abundance, while his children Emeka and Nodrozi learned lessons of humility, perseverance, and innovation, Emeka returning humbled after failed city ventures to work alongside his father, Nodrozi blossoming into a scholar who helped expand the seed program across the continent, and even as jealous rivals like Obidik tried to sabotage the garden, even as foreign powers and corrupt officials tried to co-opt or silence him, Chike stood firm, guided by a belief that small beginnings can harbor the greatest treasures, and his fame grew from a village curiosity into a continental symbol of hope, as farmers in Somalia, South Africa, and Malawi replicated his methods, feeding families, educating children, and inspiring a new generation to see the value in soil and labor, while he remained humble, rising each dawn to whisper blessings into his garden, teaching that patience, integrity, and care are worth more than fleeting riches. And as decades passed, the cooperative expanded into multiple countries, training tens of thousands of farmers, creating food security programs that directly fed millions of families, and through television, radio, and social media, the story of Baba Chike became a beacon, showing the world that Africa's solutions lay not in foreign imports or fleeting charity, but in its own soil, ingenuity, and perseverance. And even after his passing, children visiting his preserved garden could still feel the echoes of his wisdom, kneeling to touch the soil that had once fed a continent, while scholars cited him in research papers, governments honored his name with awards, and ordinary farmers repeated the simple yet powerful lesson that the man laughed at for his tiny garden had planted more than crops. He had planted hope, dignity, and an enduring legacy that generations would carry forward, reminding all that even the smallest beginning can conceal the secret to feeding nations, and that laughter at effort is often the prelude to awe at achievement. And so the tale of Baba Chike flowed from village to village, city to city, nation to nation, a continuous river of inspiration teaching patience, integrity, humility and vision, proving that the quietest hands, tending the simplest soil, can ultimately shape the destiny of millions, and that in Africa, a patch of red earth, a handful of seeds, and a man who believes in both, can change the course of history forever. In the years following his rise to fame, Baba Chike's influence spread far beyond the borders of Umuwaka, reaching towns, cities, and eventually nations, as governments invited him to share his knowledge, and scientists studied his crops to replicate the miracle across Africa. And yet he remained humble, refusing luxurious lifestyles, insisting that his home in the village, with its patched roof and red earth courtyard, remain his anchor, teaching not only his family, but thousands of farmers, the principles of sustainable agriculture, crop rotation, and seed preservation, while stories of his tiny garden inspired entire communities to reimagine their relationship with the land, turning even barren plots into productive gardens. And in every village, children followed his example, learning that diligence, observation, and love for the soil could yield results unseen by those blinded by greed or impatience. And through it all, Chike's family grew stronger, his wife Adaze, standing beside him as a pillar of wisdom and patience, her laughter now tinged with pride rather than worry, and his son Emeka, once impatient and dismissive, now worked tirelessly to coordinate regional cooperatives, teaching the younger generation to respect both the land and the labor that sustained it, while Ngozi, his daughter, became a renowned agricultural scientist, traveling across the continent to advise governments and universities, ensuring that Baba Chike's seeds and knowledge remained under African stewardship, rather than foreign control. And even as foreign corporations tried to tempt, threaten, or buy his secrets, Chike's moral compass never wavered, standing firm in the belief that the soil was the inheritance of the people, and that prosperity was measured not by coins amassed, but by lives saved, and communities nourished. And in Umuwaka, villagers who had once mocked him now honored him daily, recounting his wisdom to children, showing tourists and journalists the tiny garden that had defied ridicule, drought, and human greed to feed generations, while festivals began to celebrate harvests from his seeds, with drummers, dancers, and storytellers narrating the tale of the man who had turned patience into power, teaching all who would listen that small acts, when nurtured with faith and consistency, could ripple into monumental change. And as decades passed, the cooperative expanded into multiple countries, training tens of thousands of farmers, feeding millions of families, inspiring new generations to embrace agriculture, science, and sustainable practices, ensuring that the legacy of Baba Chike, the man laughed at for his tiny garden, remained eternal, a reminder that the smallest acts of faith and perseverance can ripple across continents, proving that laughter at humble beginnings often precedes awe at monumental achievement, that true wealth is measured not by coins, but by the lives nourished, and that the soil, patient and forgiving, holds secrets that, if tended with care, can change the course of history forever. And even as Baba Chike aged, his mornings began the same way, rising before dawn, to touch the soil of his beloved garden, whispering gratitude to the earth, for every leaf, every root, every stalk that had survived drought, ridicule, and human greed. And though his hair had turned white, and his back bent with years of labor, his spirit remained unbroken, his eyes still gleaming with the fire of vision, and villagers who watched him often remarked that he seemed less a man than a living embodiment of the soil itself, inseparable from the red earth he had nurtured. And in those quiet mornings, he would reflect on the journey that had begun decades earlier, with a handful of seeds, on the ridicule of neighbors, the doubts of his children, the jealousy of rivals, the temptations of corporations, and the countless times he had chosen patience over profit, integrity over ease, and generosity over selfish gain. And it was in these choices that his true power lay, for the garden that had once been a source of laughter had become a source of life, feeding thousands of families across Africa, creating new schools, livelihoods, and communities, inspiring young men and women to see farming not as toil, but as a sacred craft. And even in the bustling cities, farmers who had once abandoned the land returned to cultivate small plots, remembering the story of a man who had turned a tiny patch of soil into a movement that could not be bought or broken. And as Chike's fame grew, international organizations recognized his contributions, inviting him to speak at conferences, award ceremonies, and forums. Yet he remained steadfast, teaching that the soil is the foundation of freedom, that wealth is not in coins, but in nourishment, and that real power belongs to those who feed, not to those who take. And even when foreign executives arrived with contracts, promises of luxury, and threats disguised as incentives. Chike listened politely, but never wavered, explaining that the seeds must remain African, for the future of nations depended on the hands that planted them, and his family, once skeptical, became his allies, with Emeka coordinating regional cooperatives to distribute seeds, Nosy ensuring scientific integrity and sustainable growth, and Adaze supporting every initiative with wisdom, patience and care, forming a team that expanded the cooperative's reach across Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, Malawi, South Africa, and beyond, touching millions of lives, changing the perception of agriculture, proving that dignity, knowledge, and perseverance could transform society, and even those who had mocked him, laughed at him, or plotted against him, eventually bowed in respect, telling stories of the man whose stubbornness had saved them, whose dedication had fed children who might otherwise have starved, whose vision had created schools, markets, and hope where none existed, and the story of his garden, once laughed at, became a legend, repeated in classrooms, sung in songs, recited beside fires, and passed from generation to generation as a parable of patience, resilience, and the transformative power of believing in small beginnings. And when Baba Chike finally passed peacefully in his sleep, the entire continent mourned, governments declaring days of homage, farmers from distant villages arriving with baskets of harvest to lay upon his grave, children singing songs in his honor, elders reciting proverbs about seeds, soil, and patience, and the tiny garden he had tended for decades was preserved as a monument, a place where young learners could kneel, touch the earth, and remember that within dirt, sweat, and care lies the power to feed nations. And even years later, the influence of his work continued, with cooperative networks, training tens of thousands of farmers, feeding millions of families, inspiring new generations to embrace agriculture, science, and sustainable practices, ensuring that the legacy of Baba Chike, the man laughed at for his tiny garden, remained eternal, a reminder that the smallest acts of faith and perseverance can ripple across continents, proving that laughter at humble beginnings often precedes awe at monumental achievement, that true wealth is measured not by coins, but by the lives nourished, and that the soil, patient and forgiving, holds secrets that, if tended with care, can change the course of history forever. And so the story of Baba Chike, the man laughed at for his tiny garden, but whose soil fed millions, inspired the world, proving that faith, patience, and care in even the smallest patch of earth can sow a legacy greater than any riches. And if this story inspired you, subscribe and share so others may also believe in the power of small beginnings, the dignity of honest labor, and the enduring impact of one man's unwavering vision.